All right, hopefully everyone, as they start filtering in is fine, but for those who are here, it's 10:30, so we will get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 47th Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative webinar. And this is our second webinar of our 2022 series. I'm Teresa Gruninger, and I am joined by my colleague, Sam Ting from the Great Lakes Commission, and we are hosting the webinar today on behalf of the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. Before we get to our featured presentation, I wanted to introduce the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative is a partnership that links people, information, and action on invasive Phragmites. And the collaborative is coordinated jointly by the Great Lakes Commission and USGS Great Lakes Science Center with funding from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative is working towards advancing member strategies that outline in our common agenda. The common agenda is a big step towards aligning our regional goals and establishing a shared vision for change. The purpose of the common agenda is to clearly define the intentions for the collaborative, develop a shared understanding of the gaps and problems. Oh, excuse me, you guys can't see the common agenda. Hold on. There we are. And develop shared understanding of gaps and problem areas surrounding Phragmites and highlight the areas and strategies that we are working on or wish to work on. So you can learn more about our regional efforts and how to get involved by visiting our website. So a big component of our work and one of the ways we engage with Phragmites managers is through the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework, or PAMF as many of you may know it. PAMF utilizes participatory science to provide data-driven Phragmites management guidance through an adaptive management framework. What that means is we have established a way to learn what Phragmites managers are doing and turn that data into annual guidance to help managers make effective and efficient management decisions. We encourage anyone currently managing Phragmites in the Great Lakes Basin to consider joining PAMF, and you can find more information about PAMF and the collaborative on our website listed here. So a big component of our work and one of the Sorry, I'm having a bit of a delay in my slides. Okay. If anyone is interested in joining PAMF and taking advantage of PAMF's guidance, you can enroll in any of our free virtual training courses that we host on Moodle. We have lots of training resources to help anyone get started and answer questions. But of course, the PAMF team is always available to answer any questions at pamf@glc.org. If you're interested in learning more about Phragmites management and research, you can check out the resources on our website. We have management guidance and recordings of all of our past webinars. You can also join our listserv to connect with hundreds of other professionals and sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter, which includes a quarterly research roundup of academic papers published in the previous months. And you can also find links to join the newsletter and the listserv on the front page of our website at www.greatlakesphragmites.net. Additionally, today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel and website. Here you can access any of our past webinars, and you can also view and register for any upcoming webinars and presentations. So you can just follow the URL listed here. And of course, we encourage you to connect with us on social media and feel free to tag us in any Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook posts at GLPrag. So while we always strive to maintain a good webinar and minimize technical issues, we apologize for any issues that may arise. But before we get to our future presentation, we just want to note that in order to minimize the potential for interruptions and background noise, we have automatically muted all attendees, and attendees will stay muted throughout the entire presentation. And to save bandwidth, we ask that all attendees turn off their cameras, except the presenters, of course. We do encourage and will accept any written questions from the attendees during the webinar. So if you have a question that you would like to submit, you can go to the chat bubble at the top of your screen. Questions may be submitted anytime during the webinar. And while we will do our best to take all questions and comments during the webinar, if you need to leave before we've gotten to your question, we encourage you to review the webinar recording to see your question being answered. So if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you may send a message through the chat box, as well as you can direct any messages to our host, and you can email us at phragmites@glc.com or .org, excuse me, and someone will get back to you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Amy Carazano Lyon is currently a research scientist and Green Bay Restoration Project Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay on the Green Bay campus. And in this role, she coordinates with the conservation partners on projects working toward ecological restoration of coastal wetland communities. Amy is a certified wildlife biologist with the Wildlife Society and has a background in both ecology and conservation, as well as stakeholder involvement in planning processes and public engagement in conservation. We also have today with us Brian Glenzinski, and he is responsible for all conservation programs in Wisconsin, including wetland restoration and associated upland habitat delivery, land and easement acquisitions, and technical assistance with the work on public policy as it relates to wetland protection in Wisconsin and the region. Mr. Glenzinski focuses on Great Lakes and Big Rivers Initiative areas of Wisconsin, delivering wetland design and construction management, native prairie establishment, and statewide conservation planning for wetland and waterfowl. Mr. Glenzinski has worked extensively on public restoration throughout Wisconsin on private and public lands from federal and state perspectives. Responsibilities include securing public and private funds to complete the DU's mission while engaging volunteers to demonstrate progress towards the shared vision. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. And I will transfer presentation control over to you both, and please take it away.
Thank you, Teresa. And yeah, huge thank you to the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative, not only for the opportunity to share some of our work with you today, but also, as you mentioned there in that opening, all of the resources you guys have made available to us out in the field, as you'll see from this presentation. This has been a long journey, and it's been invaluable having that resource there. So a huge thank you to you guys. And then a quick shout out right away to some of our core partners, Wisconsin DNR and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who have been with us in the long haul. And we'll get to a bunch of the other partners later in the presentation. But again, my name is Brian Glenzinski. I'm the regional biologist for Wisconsin for Ducks Unlimited, and happy to be here today. Amy and I are going to kind of co-present as we go through this, so hopefully everything goes smoothly.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Just want to echo thanks to Teresa and Sam and the Great Lakes Phrag Collaborative for hosting us today. And we're looking forward to sharing some of our work with restoration and management on the Green Bay West Shore coastal wetlands. And today we'll be focusing on past and current work with introduced Phragmites, as well as wild rice restoration. There we go.
All right. So just quick geography lesson on where we're talking about. Obviously, Lake Michigan here, and Amy's actually got control, so I might need to have her give me a little pointer help there. Where Green Bay is, and the Green Bay West Shores is kind of our focus area here. And I've heard all sorts of different stats about the importance of Green Bay. This is one of the largest freshwater estuaries, and all sorts of things that I don't really know that I've fact checked them, but in any case, it's clearly an important place for a whole variety of reasons. It's referenced in Wisconsin Wildlife Action Plan and a lot of the Great Lakes plans. So, you know, it's clearly an important place we need to be working. And when you look at some of the more hard stats, it's very that's a priority place for us to be working. Wisconsin's lost about 50% of its wetlands along the Green Bay West Shores. We've lost about 70% of our wetlands, so a little higher loss rate there. But yet that stretch of shoreline still represents 50% of the total coastal wetlands that we have in Wisconsin in Lake Michigan. So I used to fly a waterfowl transect that started at the Illinois border and fly all the way up around the tip of Door County and down into Green Bay. And I can tell you from looking at that there aren't many coastal wetlands, certainly not like the ones that we have on the Green Bay West Shores that are pretty shallow, and in that gradient to the Great Lakes it's a pretty short lift compared to some of the bluffs and the features around along the rest of the Great Lakes. And so certainly for wildlife, for waterfowl, for fish, for all sorts of marsh birds and other critters, this is a priority area for us to be working.
And so in addition to the critical importance of these wetlands, we also have an area of concern within Lower Green Bay particularly. So the Lower Green Bay Fox River area of concern as designated by the US EPA. What this means is AOCs are throughout the Great Lakes, and they are areas that have experienced environmental degradation and in fact have, as a result, have beneficial use impairments that require continued restoration and work to address those. And so Lower Green Bay in particular, this area that you're seeing here in sort of the orange color in the map, certainly has a lot of environmental challenges as a result of that legacy, but also presents a lot of opportunity, particularly for restoration and management work, because we do have a lot of partners who are organized to work on environmental enhancements and improvements, as well as additional funding resources that are available to address restoration work in the area of concern. So this is also kind of part of the Green Bay story, lends itself to that historically degraded and naturally dynamic ecosystem where we work. So our first of our two species today is introduced Phragmites, and those of you who are connected with the Phrag Collaborative already know plenty about this species. Again, it's a tall wetland grass that grows very prolifically and reproduces quickly and spreads rapidly. We in the Green Bay area have experienced influence of Phragmites for quite a few decades now, and in particular in the early 2000s into the 2010s, we saw an expansion of Phragmites in the area as a result of a period of low Lake Michigan water levels. And so this plant in particular, when we talk about the coastal wetlands where we work, tends to fluctuate based on water levels over time. So we've experienced that low water period that exposed a lot of sediment and allowed for Phragmites to spread. And today we're actually now just kind of coming down from a high water period where we also saw some benefits for Phragmites management activities. So you can see in the background, here's one of the wetlands where we work, and this is Peters Marsh in Lower Green Bay. You can see the entire shoreline behind, and the background is entirely Phragmites. And so this is a challenging threat to a lot of our restoration work, and really is an ongoing management activity due to the nature of the plant in the area. We also have large expanses that are associated with the highways and industrial areas as well. So I'm sure this group also is very familiar with the impacts of Phragmites. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but important to recognize that those of us who are scientists and practitioners are particularly familiar with the ecological impacts, but there are also a number of economic and recreational impacts that impact communities where this plant is prolific, including Green Bay. We hear often from folks who recreate along the shoreline use boat launches or our property owners along the shoreline about access to the water and the views that they have from their properties. And we also have concerns from an economic standpoint toward safety and reducing threats of fire. So really important to recognize the wide scale of impacts of introduced Phragmites to both the landscape and communities as well.
So yeah, as I mentioned early on, this has been going on for quite a while. And in fact, I've been with Ducks Unlimited now for 10 years. Prior to that, I was with Wisconsin DNR for about 15 years. And a stint of that was up in Northeast Wisconsin. And so I knew a little bit about the resources up there. And when I came to DU, I immediately went up there to reach out to partners and see where DU could fit in, and came in right after DNR had completed the first phase of treatment in 2011, 2012, where they hit 3,000 acres, pretty much all the frag they could hit, mostly with helicopter along the Green Bay West Shores. And probably not your standard invasive species control strategy, but when we got there, we realized we had invested a tremendous amount of effort and resources into that treatment. And we didn't really have a solid plan for what we were going to do going forward. And so DU stepped into that role a little bit and got a grant through the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act to follow up on the treatment of those 3,000 acres. And anybody who's been involved in frag treatment realizes that that second phase is often much more difficult. We went from a helicopter to a lot of ground crews. It's much more expensive too. And so we did our best to survey that 3,000 acres, go in there and retreat everything. But we were working with public and private landowners. The cost was going up. We had these, pretty short grant periods, and the writing was kind of on the wall at the point for us that this was probably not a sustainable model to keep, after this entire footprint. And we'll get more into that a little later. But halfway through this GLPC grant is when Amy came on board, and she can talk a little bit more about the details of delivering those 1,300 acres.
Yeah, so this map shows the impact of both of those phases that Brian just mentioned. So phase 1 in the yellow and phase 2 in the purple here. And you can see from this map just the large geographic scale that these projects were completed on. So this is a roughly 50-mile stretch of shoreline. A number, as Brian said, of private landowners in addition to patches of public lands. And so following that inventory of the initial treatment areas, the phase 2 areas were selected based on need, basically, for follow-up Phragmites treatments. And it's also important to recognize too, with the private lands, that permissions were needed from landowners to be able to treat next to their properties. So this also impacted the footprint of really both of these phases, as well as far as where treatment could take place. So large scale, as Brian said, very, very costly, and in a lot of cases, a very short timeline where we only have maybe 2 years to come in and do a treatment and then a follow-up. So recognize that this was pretty ambitious, and that kind of led us to our current phase that we're working in now. I should mention, here's just a quick a zoom in shot to kind of show you a little closer of what that looks like as far as the retreatment areas along with the originally treated sites.
Yeah, so just to catch us up to where we are now, this is kind of current phase where we've gone to a little bit different approach, where we've identified priority coastal marshes. I should back up before we go there, and I don't want to make it seem like we did bail on all that area. I think Amy mentioned this a little bit before. The high lake levels have really helped us. And so a lot of those areas that were treated and are not now part of one of our priority coastal marshes are really in pretty good shape thanks to the high water levels that we had there. What happens in some of those areas that aren't a priority coastal marsh as lake levels recede, that is a big question mark. But moving forward, we tried to come up with at least a sustainable program that we could support, and that's where these priority coastal marshes came to be. And we've got about 1,000 acres of priority coastal marsh that we survey and try to keep in good shape, which results in about 300 acres of invasive species control every year. So a much more manageable number. And then with that, we can get into some more intense techniques for controlling those patches. So. And site selection was driven a lot. This is a great example of how funding sources and priorities within those funding sources can translate to priorities on the ground. And so these are all Great Lakes coastal wetland monitoring sites, which were priorities in the Sustain Our Great Lakes grant, which is supporting a lot of the work we do right now. And so we adopted those, and it's really not a big surprise. I think if we would have done an independent evaluation, we would have probably came up with these sites on our own because they are some of the best and biggest coastal marshes left on the Green Bay West Shore. And I should mention too that this is the point too when the native species restoration came into being as well. And so when we look at where we want to focus those efforts to, it was lining up right with these priority areas as well. So, and with Point Cobble, Atkinson Marsh, Pete's Lake, Longtail Point, Dead Horse Bay, Swamico River, Ocano Marsh, Peshtigo River, and Seagull Bar. A lot of those are at the mouth of rivers that flow into Green Bay. So adopted those and are continuing to manage invasive species on those sites.
So here's a map example focusing on our phase 3 effort here. This is one priority wetland. This is Seagull Bar, which is located in Marinette, Wisconsin. You can see that there are a number of different invasive vegetation techniques that were done. This is an example from 2021. So this is summarizing the work that was done just last year, including some herbicide spot treatment, as well as cutting underwater for Phragmites, as well as hand pulling for a new aquatic invasive species that we'll mention later. But again, the effort here was very site specific and very much tailored to the site based on the invasive species situation at that location, as well as native vegetation restoration goals. So to quickly just summarize a little bit of kind of where we are with Phragmites management. We talked about this transition to more of a smaller scale and mixed mode effort toward Phragmites management. And in general, that does work very well. You can see the two photos at the top are from a shoreline site at the Point Sable location in Lower Green Bay. And this was a site that was spaded, and in a matter of a few minutes, we were able to remove Phragmites from the site. You see instant gratification basically, and are able to make an impact through this effort. However, it's important to recognize that it is a lot of work and requires a lot of time, inventory, and boots on the ground to make these efforts effective. However, it is also beneficial to get folks together on a lot of these sites to build networking opportunities and connect with partner groups. So you see in the lower photo, we had a group get together to do some Phragmites removal at one of our wild rice restoration sites last year. And it's a nice opportunity to engage with partners and contribute to a work day where we can see immediate success, basically. And you'll notice in the photo, there's a bunch of bagged frag. So just wanted to note that we did bag and dry the material, and then it was sent to a landfill for disposal. So one of the important series of questions that came up in discussing management for these priority coastal marshes was, how do we engage with native vegetation on these locations, particularly those that have been impacted by Phragmites, and recognizing again that management of frag is a long-term commitment. What can we do to encourage native vegetation on these sites and prevent some of the situations that we've seen in the past where we have thousands of acres of frag on the Green Bay West Shore? So we've had a lot of discussions about the importance of native aquatic vegetation in particular, and that kind of led us to our next species that we'll highlight here.
So we'll give you a quick refresher or introduction to wild rice here and some of the basics. One thing I should note, I mentioned before, when we went to priority coastal marshes and started doing this native work as well, that's when U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coastal program came in and was a big partner to help do the native side of things, and that was paired with the SOGO work to do the invasive side of things. So it's another kind of a good example of how funding sources can work together to complement each other, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But so wild rice is a native annual aquatic grass. There's two species, Aquatica, which is sometimes called southern rice or river rice, and palustris, which is sometimes called northern or lake rice. Most of what we are sourcing is palustris for our restoration efforts. But it likes shallow, clear water with some flow is great, and usually in soft organic sediment, although as we'll talk about it later, might not be as picky as we thought. But along with that, there's a ton of ecosystem services coming from this. So obviously, being a Ducks Unlimited guy, the food resource for waterfowl is unmatched pretty much in the natural world is what you can get from wild rice. So great habitat, but we're all talking about ecological services these days. And so the water quality impacts of wild rice through nutrient uptake and sediment retention are huge, as well as some of the storm surge protection that it provides. And obviously this plant has significant cultural resource value to native tribes, Menominee and Ojibwe in Wisconsin. And so, for those reasons alone, it's a great species to pick and work with. We've often talked about charismatic megafauna. This is kind of our charismatic megaflora that really draws in a lot of interest. So real quick on the life cycle of wild rice, in a couple months here that the seed we dropped, or that was naturally dropped, will start germinating. And in the end of June, we'll reach that floating leaf stage. This is kind of a critical point for the plant where it's susceptible to wave activity that can uproot the plant. You think about all that surface area being on the top of the water, and water level fluctuation or wave action can uproot that plant. So that's a critical time. And then later in the summer, it emerges from the water, and then flowering in late July into August. Usually, when people are out collecting wild rice seed is late August, early September is about the time when people are out collecting wild rice. And then senesces pretty quickly after that in late September into October. And then that's obviously when Mother Nature is dropping the seed. So not long after that is when we would do our seeding, and we try to time that as late as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So a little history of wild rice in Green Bay. We have a lot of accounts from early settlers coming into Green Bay and talking about the massive stands of wild rice. One from Jenks in 1901 talked about rice being present from the Menominee River southward to the head of the bay, with extensive beds of rice at every river mouth. And so again, when we talked about our site selection, those river mouths were obviously places where we had historic strongholds of wild rice. And some of that held on through time, but by the 50s, most of it was gone. Carp were introduced to the Great Lakes, and that had a huge impact on some of those rice areas. We hardened our shorelines. And so what little rice was hanging on then got hit with the Phragmites invasion. And so, by the 50s, the rice was gone from the lower Green Bay, and we maybe had a few places holding on up in northern Green Bay. But for the most part, it was gone from Green Bay by the 50s. And so we started looking at restoring wild rice, and this is just kind of a little basic wild rice restoration stuff. This has been pretty well documented. You seed wild rice at about 50 pounds per acre. Some people would say higher than that, but I think that's a standard rate to seed wild rice. As I mentioned, we go in late fall as close to ice up as possible. As you see on the left there, that's actually the pilot project where we were doing small plots, so we were able to drop it actually through the ice. But there have been a couple years where we've cut it a little too close and had to break some ice to seed rice. But the main reason for that is to try to get it under the ice and minimize the amount of herbivory that might happen from waterfowl that are coming through in the spring. And then something that we've done a lot of and is a great field day is to engage volunteers and partners to do this. It's not that scientific. We establish a polygon and give somebody the appropriate poundage of acres for however many acres that polygon is, and tell them to spread it as evenly as you can around that polygon, and we'll have that staked out for them. So it's a great way to get people involved in a pretty low tech seeding operation. So from that start in 2014, and I don't know if Bree is on the webinar today, but Bree Kupski was the person there you saw drilling holes in the ice, putting those first seeds in Green Bay in 2014. And I still remember Bree and Patrick Robinson calling up and saying, we've got wild rice in lower Green Bay again. And we were pretty excited, probably a little overly optimistic, but excited to have wild rice growing in lower Green Bay again. And so in 2015, we went ahead and tried to seed, or we seeded a 7-acre pilot project there, a little bigger spot, to see how that did. And again, we saw some success there and ramped that up to 20 acres. And then you can see in 2017, we went to our priority coastal marshes and expanded our program. And you can kind of see where we've gone from there. There's an interesting story with each of these sites, and Amy can probably talk more about them, but some of them are failures, some of them are successes, like Point Sable 2019. High water allowed carp access into the lagoon where we were working, and just pretty much destroyed that site. So it became pretty inhospitable to wild rice, and we bailed on that one. But stuff like lower Peshtigo River there, you see we stopped in 2020, 2021. That's because that is a sustainable population that is doing well on its own. And so something to note too is that while you see pretty consistent acres, a lot of times those are not the same acres, and they're moved around slightly depending on water levels and what's happening out there. And so a lot of work goes into that seeding plan every year. And then stuff happens like in 2021 where we just had a failure of rice harvesting in the region. And so we get a lot of our rice from Minnesota and some from Mole Lake in Wisconsin. Both of those sources had a real tough time. Storms damaged the rice crop right at end of August there when people were going out there. And so we had to do our best with what we could get, and obviously scaled way back to a much smaller footprint, but we'll see about getting that back up again in 2022.
And so following the restoration seedings, we've been specifically through UW Green Bay, we've been working on wild rice monitoring each of the growing seasons over the last 4 years. And as part of that effort, we visit all of the sites that have been seeded throughout the growing season, usually from May to September. And during those visits, we're tracking a number of things, including environmental conditions. So things like water depth, flow, any storm events that have happened recently, looking at the sediment hardness and composition, as well as some of the biotic factors like the aquatic plant community, including floating, submergent, and emergent plants, and also wildlife use, so grazing from geese or other waterfowl, as well as observations that we are able to take while we're on site. So we've been building that protocol and really have a developing data set where we have multi-years of data from many of the sites that you just saw in the last slide. In addition to tracking some of those environmental conditions, we're also, of course, specifically looking at wild rice and tracking things like the density of plants that come up in an area that we've seeded. Also tracking the phenology throughout the growing season, which I'll share a figure that demonstrates that here next. And as I mentioned, also looking at any damage to the plants, which might be from storms or a drastic water level fluctuation, like a big rain event, or even in some cases, excessive grazing or herbivory by waterfowl. So this has been a great opportunity for us to engage with students. Most of the monitoring protocol is a big part of our summer field crew. So we've had a number of students who have worked on this project over the years who've contributed to this data set now. So here's an example of some phenology information from one of the sites. So this is Seagull Bar, which we mentioned as an example earlier. And this figure is actually a Gantt chart, so often used for project management or looking at timelines for different project activities. But we've employed it here to look at the different life stages of wild rice. And so you'll see there are 3 sites represented here, and in each section, you see the kind of color-coded bars that represent the different life stages based on our observations when we're on site. So this is a little bit limited because it required us to be present every 2 weeks to be able to kind of get a visual on this, but it is really helpful to see the progression throughout the season. In this case, you can see that all of the sites experienced germination and plants went through that floating leaf, emergent and flowering stages. We also saw seed that was both developing and dropping on all 3 sites. And also we're able to observe the start of senescence at the end of the season as well. So this is an example of a site that responded quite well to seeding of wild rice, and we have some information here that helps us understand that those plants are continuing to contribute seed to the system, because as we mentioned earlier, wild rice as an annual plant is very reliant on seed to be part of its life cycle for the next year. In contrast, here's a Gantt chart example from another site. This is the Duck Creek Delta, which is located in the Lower Green Bay area of concern. You can see again, there are 3 sites that are represented here, but the the bars that you see on the Gantt chart look a little bit different. So we do have the first site at the top does see some development throughout the season, and we do see a small amount of seed production toward the end, shown in the green there. Well, you'll notice for the other two sites, we have germination followed by some other life stages at the second site there, but we have loss of plants later on in the season, so about midsummer in the second site, and much earlier, just immediately following germination on the third site represented there. And so this kind of goes along with what we were observing from the environmental conditions standpoint, because this area does see frequent turbidity, so the water clarity is not consistently good here compared to the site I just showed you. And we also have seen in a couple of the years some pretty significant algae outbreaks, which also have potential to seriously impact the plants as well. So what have we observed so far? Kind of applying some of the information from what's available in the literature and what partners have told us with what we've observed. Some of the things match up pretty well. We know that good to excellent water clarity is really important, and we see that in our data thus far with rice production. And in particular, we have observed a gradient in success with wild rice restoration, kind of based on the West Shore itself. So the sites that are located at the northern end or about mid Green Bay tend to do a lot better than the sites that are located in lower Green Bay within the AOC area. And there are a few reasons for that, but some may be related more to environmental conditions, whereas others could be a little more site specific as well. We see that rice tends to do best with coexisting with a diverse aquatic plant community. Not surprising, makes a lot of sense. So we often see it in places where we have other aquatic plants that are also doing well. And one of the unique things that we're finding that is a little bit different from what's available in the literature is the relationship with a more moderate sandy sediment. And typically, as Brian noted earlier, rice is associated with that soft, mucky sediment. So we're not exactly sure why this is, but to speculate, it could be related to a little bit more of a sturdy environment, particularly in a dynamic system like Green Bay, where that heavier sandy sediment provides a bit more stability. It could also be site-specific related, since many of the sites at Mid-Bay are a little bit sandier in general than lower Green Bay. And we're also seeing that, of course, limited disturbance is important for rice success. And in our system specifically, we do have a pretty significant impact from common carp, especially in the early season when rice is in that germination and floating leaf stage. And so we have seen a few sites where rice doesn't survive that type of disturbance at the level that we currently, have carp influencing the system. In addition to carp, we also, focus on storm events and wind events, because Green Bay is a fairly large body of water, and we do see pretty significant wave action and water level fluctuations called seiches as a result of wind activity. So we know that this affects rice, again, particularly in that early season time period when it is very susceptible to damage. We're also finding some additional information that kind of lends itself to a lot of these environmental conditions related findings. So we did a little camera trap study on some of the seeded sites as part of the restoration effort, and we're able to document wildlife use of those sites. You see here a wood duck who is kind of reaching up for the seed. This is a plant available in August, so we noticed especially that wood ducks were particularly interested in the seed. We also saw a lot of Canada geese on camera, and they were often very interested in the leaves that were produced earlier in the season. So this type of information can help us to understand some of that environmental characteristics that we're tracking. So if we see herbivory, for example, we have a little bit more detail on who might be responsible and when that specifically is occurring. One of the other things we're finding is how interested a lot of the community members are in wild rice restoration and monitoring and seeding even. We've had a lot of contacts with groups and individuals who just expressed a lot of interest and wanted to be a part of it. And the photos that you see here are from an event we had last fall with a middle school group called the Great Lakes Explorers, who came out with us to seed a 1 acre site at Barkhausen Waterfowl Preserve. And we also were able to partner with the Appleton Rotary Club to welcome them into that group for seeding. So it was a great work day where we were able to get folks together and really engage people in the process of restoration, which has been really interesting and very rewarding. So as a result of some of that interest, we also developed an additional project where we were working with teachers in our region to provide access to and opportunities for using wild rice in the classroom. And we're able to work with teachers to give them a set of very simple supplies and some wild rice seed to be able to actually work with their students to grow wild rice in buckets like you see here. And this has been a really awesome opportunity to provide, learning engagement with students in the classroom so they can work on a scientific experiment. You can talk about Indigenous studies or cultural studies. You can work on math, you name it. So there's many subjects that teachers have expressed interest in, kind of working with wild rice in the classroom as a tool to get the kids excited about what they're learning and also about the impacts that they can have on restoration. Because we work with all of the teachers to bring these plants that they produce to restoration sites to contribute to that effort as well. So it's a very place-based, but also really diverse learning opportunities that could be applied across the board. And this year we have over 300 students participating, 15 teachers at 13 different schools. So this is really growing, and it's exciting to see how many folks are interested in this project. And particularly this year, we have students as young as kindergarten growing wild rice in their classroom all the way through high school. So it's applicable at any grade level.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up a little bit on what Amy just touched there, which is just an awesome outcome that we had always, had written in community involvement into our grant and trying to figure out how we're going to execute that, and seeing that program take off. I mentioned we had a rough year securing rice, and so we prioritized basically all the sites that had any sort of that direct community outreach. Simply for this reason, I think that deliverable of the education outreach component of this project is sometimes surpasses the acres on the ground. And so I'm sure Amy's probably inspired a few wetland ecologists already through this. And like she mentioned, the word of mouth is growing this program exponentially to the point where we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do going forward here. But that does bring me into this slide about future considerations. And I talked a little bit more about the adaptive wild rice seeding plan that we develop every year. And everybody, the PANTH adaptive management, it's all about adapting to the what's presenting itself out there. But as you can imagine, in that 1,000 acres of priority coastal marshes that we've committed to, there's more opportunity, a lot more acres than the 40 acres that you see us planting on an average year. And so we'll continue to evaluate those sites, look for opportunities, and expand. seeding plan going forward. And to that end, securing additional funding to keep this going. Like I mentioned, we are right now on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coastal program that ends this year. And so we just submitted a Sustain Our Great Lakes grant that combines exactly what we were talking about today, a little bit of the invasive species component, along with the native introductions to our priority coastal marshes. So the future is hopefully looking bright for this program, and it is growing, and it is kind of taking on a life of its own. So hopefully we can figure out how to keep it going and support those folks. It is something we are really focused on in this next SOGO grant, is to get that community support. So hopefully they'll be a little more independent, and we can talk more about that. But some of the other things we're thinking about are climate considerations, and how wild rice is going to do in this, and maybe the difference between, if the name Southern rice has anything to do with it, maybe we should be looking at Southern rice, the Aquatica species versus the Palustris. But we need a little more work there to figure out some of those variables. And then looking into other native aquatic vegetation, there are some limiting factors with an annual, and so it would be excellent to try to find out more of a perennial species that we will be able to combat frag when lake levels come down. And so we'll continue to explore options in those priority coastal marshes to expand native aquatic vegetation. And so some lessons learned, and we talked about partnerships a little bit already, but we can't stress enough how important that partnership is, not only between our core folks like DNR and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but in the lower picture there, in the bright yellow pants, you see Peter McGeeshick. It's actually a rice chief from the Mole Lake tribe, and learned a ton from him. Not only is he helping shape our program, but then also next to him is someone from the Ocano Sportsman's Club, not only in helping shape our program, but also in actually getting the work done and implementing the program. And so these are some of the things we're going to expand on. And the top picture is at Barkhausen again. These are some of the opportunities we want to focus on moving forward, and set these folks up to be maybe more of an independent, almost like an Adopt a Coastal Marsh program, where the Ocano Sportsman's Club would take on our priority coastal marsh as their marsh, and control invasives and facilitate native plant establishment.
So another lesson learned is related to building on community engagement. I think a lot of the opportunities that we've had as part of this project really came to us from community members, which has been really exciting, and also have really benefited this work overall. So on the left, you see some Menominee Indian High School students who joined us last fall to do a demo wild rice harvesting at one of our sites, which was a great learning opportunity for all of us. And it was something that really benefited both the site and the work that we're doing. We also mentioned the Great Lakes Explorers and the Rotarians. They were able to combine their rice seeding event with a wood duck box building activity. So that was also a way they could contribute to the wetland restoration on a broader scale too. So taking advantage of these opportunities when these great ideas come up, especially from community members.
We talked about adaptive management quite a bit already, so we'll breeze over this one, but just interesting that, the variable lake levels, while have assisted in the control of Phragmites, have hindered some of our native plant restoration efforts. So it's the lake levels on Lake Michigan have are much more dynamic than I ever envisioned. And so that creates some challenges, but we're adapting to them. And then the combination of a native restoration project along with invasive species obviously has some efficiency results. When crews are out there, we can monitor for presence of wild rice and how the wild rice is doing, while at the same time doing some control for invasive species. So it's a great approach on a targeted, priority area where you can get a little bigger bang for your buck and working on both those efforts at the same time.
And last lesson learned that we'll share is a relatively new one. So last year, our field crew contributed to the discovery of a new aquatic invasive species in Wisconsin, which was located on, unfortunately, in quite a few of our coastal priority wetlands. So we're able to work with partners to do some initial inventory, and Wisconsin DNR is working on a management plan for this species. So this is European frogbit, which is like a very small lily pad shaped floating aquatic plant. And you can see here that it develops these very dense mats that impacts wetlands. And in particular, some of these coastal wetlands where we have wild rice and these slower moving, more protected systems. So this will be on our to-do list over the next few years to continue to work on this aquatic invasive species. So recognizing, again, being flexible and adjusting the plan a little bit when new information or new species come onto the scene. And so with that, we'll just close by thanking all of the UW Green Bay students who have been a part of the project over the years, and all of their contributions definitely made this work possible.
And also like to thank all the partners. We mentioned a lot of them already, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Coastal Program, Fox River NRDA, National Fish and Wildlife Federation through the Sustain Our Great Lakes Grant, the Fund for Lake Michigan, and then obviously our organizations, UW Green Bay and Ducks Unlimited, support for putting this work on the ground. So thank you very much. And I don't know if we've got time for questions, but happy to take some now.
Yeah, I think we have some time, and especially if you two don't necessarily mind staying a bit maybe over. It looks like we already have quite a few questions in the chat. So if you guys do have questions for our presenter, please enter them into the chat box now. We'll get to the ones that you guys have already brought up. And here is Amy and Brian's contact information. So that was such a great presentation, and we really appreciate you guys sharing your work with us. So if your question comes along like later in the day, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your question. All right. So we'll start with one of the questions that came up first from Abigail. She said, this is such a huge project. I'm assuming it was very visible to the public. Was there a public outreach aspect to the 3,000 acres treated along the bay?
I'll start with that and then pass it over to Amy. I was not involved in the 3,000 acres. That was a DNR-led project before I came involved. So don't know exactly what public outreach was done there, but during our GLPC phase of the project, there was some public outreach, and Amy can maybe talk a little bit more specific about her involvement there.
Yeah, I think we did have quite a few news media stories that came out during that time frame to share information about the project with people and the importance of, managing frag. We also did a lot of landowner outreach specifically. So some of that was one-on-one or potentially through the county conservationists in each of the counties that were partners on the project. So there definitely was some outreach at that stage, but of course, for such a large geographic scale, it was hard to reach everybody.
Thank you. Another question from Sam. Were there any restrictions for disposing the Phragmites stems that were cut and bagged?
No, I don't think that Wisconsin DNR has any restrictions as long as it's bagged and marked as such for disposal.
Perfect. A question from Abigail. At Sable Point, where frag was cut, did that stimulate further growth later in the season or for the next seasons?
Yeah, good question. So the site that I showed responded pretty well to spading that particular year. There is quite a bit of monitoring effort at Point Sable specifically because that one is a UW Green Bay property. So we have a lot of folks who work out there and are able to follow up on those sites. So it's a good example of a place where we do have the capacity to continue to follow up when we do see resurgence of frag. And for the most part, the areas we had done removal there were small enough that we were able to easily follow up on them in the future. So I can't say that we saw a resurgence per se, but they certainly were followed up on and addressed as any issues arose.
All right, thank you. A question from Janelle. Has Green Bay tested for hybridization between native and invasive lineages, or is hybridization uncommon out in the field? For Phragmites there.
Yeah, that's a great question too. No, to my knowledge, I don't think there's been any testing for hybridization, although others may have been involved in that. So I can't say that definitively, but we do, I guess anecdotally, I would say that I do think there is potential for hybridization, especially toward some of the northern sites at about mid-Green Bay, because the native species does occur a little more often there versus lower Green Bay. So the potential is there, but no, we don't have specific information toward hybridization at this point.
Okay, and this question I feel like might have been answered a little bit, but if you want to add anything else to it, Francine asked, where does the wild rice seed come from that is being planted?
Yeah,
you want to take that one, Brian?
You bet. Initially, we started with most of our rice coming from Minnesota, lakes in northern Minnesota. And then more recently, the Mole Lake folks have contributed wild rice to the effort. And so we try to get a mix of the both as best we can. But like we mentioned, it kind of sometimes comes down to wherever you can get it. So, but those are our two main sources.
Thank you. Gedaliah asks, is there a curriculum available for any of your wild rice activities?
That's a great question. So we're still in the very early stages of that project. This is only year 2 that we've had the opportunity to work with teachers on that. So we are receiving some feedback from them at this initial stage to hopefully develop a good set of instructions and list of resources that we'd like to share more widely in the future. So at this stage, there isn't anything publicly available, but we're building that with our teachers to work toward that in the future.
Nice. Yeah, I'm sure people would be interested. And I'll ask these 2 questions at once because they're kind of similar. So Abigail said I might have missed it, but are there Indigenous communities a part of the wild rice projects? And someone asked, is the Oneida tribe interested in restoring wild rice in Green Bay area?
Yes.
I can start with some of that, but yes, they are involved. Like I mentioned, the Mole Lake tribe, and specifically Peter McGeeshick, the rice chief from the Mole Lake tribe, is probably our biggest contributor and helps quite a bit on the project. And then Amy can talk a little bit too about the Menominee and the school connections.
Yeah, so the Menominee School District is participating in wild rice in the classroom. So we have, I think, 5 or 6 different teachers from the tribal school that are growing rice in the classroom right now, from elementary through high school. And really excited to have that opportunity to build relationship with them. And we're hoping to do a restoration project on the reservation with the Menominee tribes plants that they grow in their schools. So we're excited for that later this spring. So more to come on that. But to the second question, the Oneida Nation does quite a bit of restoration with wild rice on their reservation. They have a really excellent program going on. That is, of course, a little bit outside of the Green Bay coastal wetlands that we talked about today. And also, it's my understanding that the Oneida Nation is not as culturally connected to wild rice as Menominee and Ojibwe tribes as well. So they are doing an excellent job with it and care very much, of course, about wild rice, but it is not, as ingrained in their culture as some of the other tribes we work with.
Thank you. And I saw someone put a follow-up comment about the hybridization. Lisa commented, Bobby Webster from University of Green Bay and I worked on a project where we looked at Phragmites. It did not find any hybridization around Green Bay in our samples. So
excellent. Thanks,
looks
Lisa.
like they're looking into it already. Tara had a question, and she said, confirming that only Z. Posteris is currently being used in this project, correct? I may have missed why Z. aquatica is being considered now, but wasn't included initially.
I can tackle some of that. One, the palustris is one of the more common rice, and is the main rice that is collected in the fall. It's generally a shorter rice, much easier to collect seed on. The aquatica just seems to be a little taller, and I have tried to collect aquatica before, and by the time you bend it over your canoe, half of it ends up on the other side of the canoe and drops in the water. So it's just not commercially available for us. And so as we start thinking about that, we're going to have to try to figure out how and where to collect aquatica if we want to go down that route.
Thank you. We have a question from Steve. Can you provide details on Rice Fest?
Yeah, absolutely. To be determined for 2022, but usually it happens in late October. We usually schedule dates for seeding at quite a few locations on the Green Bay West Shore. So we're happy to share that information with folks who might like to join us for some rice seeding later in the year.
Awesome, thank you.
To be determined.
A question from Tom. Through this work, have you been able to establish thresholds for achieving success with the reestablishment of wild rice, such as turbidity, bottom conditions, etc.? Help with identifying future opportunities for restoration?
Yeah, so that exactly is part of our intent, to be able to collect information as part of our monitoring protocol to contribute to adaptive management and influence future years of wild rice seeding and restoration. So as far as, we're kind of hoping to develop this almost like a quote unquote prescription of what we're looking for in the Green Bay coastal wetlands to identify what would be the best sites for restoration opportunities in the future. And of course that changes based on Lake Michigan lake levels and other things that we're seeing, but we are kind of working toward that. The ability to kind of establish a site specific, if you will, for such a broad geography prescription for what we're looking for on sites for potential future restoration too.
Yeah, and I just add to that too, that certainly we've kind of, and Amy mentioned that gradient of pretty poor sites to very more pristine and successful sites. But it's also, there's a ton of restoration work going on in the AOC, in the Fox River, in the Duck Creek, that will long-term affect the water quality in the bay. And so not only, are we hopefully going to have that prescription for where to go next, but also, at what point can we try again in the lower Green Bay once hopefully water quality improves and some of the site conditions improve, that it might be time to give it a go again in some of those sites that failed earlier. So good question.
Yeah. A question from Dan. How many years of Phragmites control was done at each site before the seeding of the wild rice?
It varies a little bit, as you saw in that initial frag program, that the treatment from DNR in 2011, some of those were treated twice through that grant. Some of our sites received multiple treatments. So it could be anywhere from 1 to probably 4 times potentially. And like Amy had mentioned too, those priority sites that are continuing to get wild rice seeding, there's consistent Phragmites control from year to year on those. And so depending on how you define control, you know, some of them might be 6 years of control because we've been out there doing some of that more intense management every year.
Yeah, I'll just add that quite a few of the priority wetlands are wildlife areas that are owned and managed by the Wisconsin DNR, and they also have, of course, their own invasive vegetation treatment efforts that have happened on some of these sites kind of outside of the larger efforts we mentioned today. So in some cases, it could be quite a few years that follow-up treatment or other types of management have been done on these wetlands.
All right, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but like I mentioned, I'm sure they're happy to answer questions by email if you have one. And a later thought, we just want to reiterate that the recording of today's webinar will be shared through the Eventbrite link. So if you wanted to rewatch it or miss some of it or wanted to share it out with any of your colleagues, we'll let you know when that is available to view on our website. And just to promote that we do have an upcoming webinar on Wednesday, April 6th at 10:30 Eastern. So this will be the third one in our 2022 series. We'll have 2 presentations in the same 1-hour format. We'll have Melanie from Fisheries Ocean Canada presenting her work on flooded Phragmites that provides habitat for Great Lakes coastal wetland fishes. And we'll have Prabhav of McMaster's University presenting mapping invasive Phragmites australis in the Lake Erie wetlands using multispectral satellite image. So it should be a really good talk, and registration is open on the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative's website. So where you registered for this webinar, so feel free to register and see them talk in about 2 weeks. And we just wanted to thank everybody for watching. And we wanted to, acknowledge the U.S. Geological Survey and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for providing funding that supports our collaborative. So as a reminder, the webinar recording will be posted on the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative's website in the next few days. And if you have any additional follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to contact us at phragmites@glc.org. Thank you to our presenters. That was really interesting, and it sounds like a lot of people are really interested in your work. So yeah. Thank you, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.